ambiguous, complex, uncertain. In all sense of VUCA, I dare to say and challenge that programmatic design of the most progressive education today is still a problem. The way that we look at curriculum development is a program to be taught, to be learned, to be assessed as an exam is problematic. And I don't have an answer for that because reality is from a 3 months time where the company was about to celebrate to be listed in New York's listing, and lo and behold, because of new trade law policy from US, China, big products are all pulled off the shelf. And this is where I say, what kind of thinking really should look at that? We talk about this, and really, I had a very good discussion earlier with Anne from Science Center, and we're saying, are we really talking about transdisciplinary? In fact, I would question us. Are we ready for transdisciplinary learning? Because if you read the papers, current understanding of the Yale liberal arts and why the withdrawal from NUS, there are background stories to that. But the key question I asked is about readiness. Yes, we are progressive and we look towards the future. But the reality is, how can we move knowledge in situ? How might we learn differently from interdisciplinary to trans? That's the main challenge. Let me give a bit more context. One of my biggest aha was this. 20 years ago, when I was still a science head of department in a school, one of my students who is in the prefect council came up and said, "Hey, Mr. Yo, I've done well, and thank you for being my teacher." And of course, I celebrate. But one of aha that I had, and it still puzzles me, was this line that he said. I asked him, "What do you enjoy most of science education in the school that I was heading and I was teaching?" And the child says, "Well, I learned that science, bio, chemistry, physics, they are very different. So I am struggling with my career decision. I don't know whether to be a scientist in chemistry, scientist in physics, or scientist in biology. My background, I was a biologist." And I asked, "What's the big difference in your opinion?" So I asked very honestly. And he says, "For example, Mr. Yo, in the textbook, sorry, I'm very Singaporean. In the textbook that we have, right, the way that electrons are taught, right, is very fascinating in physics because they move here and there, electrons move here and there." I still remember the discussion because he's a graduate. But the way that the electrons are taught in chemistry is very boring. It's just taught as cross and zero. And the best part that slapped my face was when he said, "In biology, right, Mr. Yo, y'all don't teach electrons, so I'm not excited to be a biologist." And if those of us who have remembered science, this is a big fallacy, because the reality is, it is simply the way that the textbooks have been scripted or represented differently. The way that Pan Pacific writes it is very different from how Marshall Cavendish presents electrons in textbooks. Right? And that scares me because the fact is, all atoms are made of electrons, protons, neutrons. Right? And this is frightening because if this is my top student graduating with an A1 in chemistry, physics, and biology, but can tell me that they are different, I said, God help us. So I'm asking this because the way that we learn today, even with the advent of digitization and how things are going into a blended learning mode, how might we make learning to be a lot more authentic? How might we make learning to be a lot more real? So that it's not just conceptual understanding, but how do we create some of these? And that's why I shared this, because the reality is it's not about me talking about these two things, but how do you actually make learning, right? Something that is actionable. And that's where transdisciplinary is a big gap. And this is where I'm going to share several of the projects that I have piloted all these years. My dream is this. As I hold the two space of a school administrator. So I was running, I was MOE's school leader, and then I went to run and start an international school in SIM, and then I was headhunted to run an international school in Korea. I keep wondering, how do you make education something that not only teaches head knowledge, but also really prepares students for the future? And I think the biggest gap is it's not about just putting in more programs, not IB, not GCE or IGCSE, right? Not all of that. The biggest problem is it's also not about skills learning, but how might we take the understanding of concepts beyond that and make them so real and so close to the heart? I'm saying this because I spent a good 5 years in Ministry of Education, and I was one of the task force back in 2006 to 2010 to design this 21st century competency model. This was at a policy level, where at a policy level, you design a forward-looking curriculum that's going to pave the way for Singapore for a long time. The reality is, how might this translate into school-based curriculum? How might the schools enact these values, these skill sets, and these big concepts? I then was also in charge of the project work. And at A level, at the advanced level in Singapore, project work really is about interdisciplinary. It's really about interdisciplinary learning. Right? At A level, they can't just regurgitate information, and these are the learning outcomes, even based on 2021 exam syllabus. However, the 4 learning outcomes, you can see the last 2 on collaboration and independent learning. I put an asterisk because in SEAB, which is our exam board, it clearly says that those last 2 components are not being accessed. You don't evaluate how students are collaborating, even though it's part of it. You can't evaluate students' independent learning because it's about gathering of information and it's about process learning. So we can only evaluate how students learn via the first 2, which is number 1, knowledge application is largely in the various reports that students submit. Communication is where they have to make an oral presentation at the end of the 10 months course in project work. And all of these would account for 10% of their grades to be admitted into the university in Singapore. All good and great, right? And I've worked in MOE and even in the place that I cannot mention, where we talk about the integrity of exam systems, right? And this is where I am often very stuck. I throw this dilemma that which is not being accessed is not learned. Right? Because the fact is, the first 2 components of knowledge application and communication can be literally taught to pass or to do well in tests. And more importantly, the question is, with today's landscape, while this is a good way forward in terms of designing for interdisciplinary learning, because it requires you to have research skills, it requires you to learn about a topic that's close to your heart. Oftentimes it's community driven, but does it really tap on, number 1, our learners' interest? Because if the future of every child's career starts off with a point of what do you like to study and what do you hope that you can make use of after you graduate, that might be a useful thought line for you to design your future pathway, especially on what course to take in the university level. But the question is, has interest of the child developed further mastery? Has interest of the group learning allowed them to take the knowledge beyond? And my second question that I challenge is this. Project work really is an awesome subject because it forces them to think beyond their comfort zone. It allows them opportunities to look at issues from different perspectives and to take some action towards that. But the reality is a lot of it is still very cognitive. There's a lot of paper writing, right? And the fact is, in today's world, where it's no longer just about how well you write, right? We don't just want elite students who can write very well, but we want students who know what the passions are. We want students who are driven to take actions and to try it out, right? And to say I've gained success in some of these, I have learned real experience to go with it. What's next? The reality is, from a curriculum perspective, so while I design curriculum, we also have to look at what are the push and pull factors of curriculum, right? And for the longest time, education systems are resistant to change because it is hard to change the white elephant in the room. Nobody will tell you that we take away exams because exams is still one of the key milestones to see how good you are by your performance and how good a job you might potentially get, because that's what still the yardsticks of what employers want. In China, we know is one of the biggest driving force, right? In curriculum term, we have this term called hegemony. The hegemonic effect of economics really shapes how education gets lagged behind or loses. That's why, for example, even my work with Cambodia right now, they want to become a digitally ready country, right, by the government force. But a lot of these questions is, what are the interventions that allows this? This was featured in yesterday's papers. And it tells us China bans retooling education system, which basically means cannot have tuition law, right? And you know, when China government says something, they mean it. Right? So the fact is, a lot of these big actions are changing the educational landscape globally. One of the ways that we can look at transdisciplinary learning is, where does it fit in the big picture of future skills? And from this research, it tells us these are what's important and necessary. And transdisciplinary learning has also been featured. Question is, how do you teach the various components that make up transdisciplinary learning? The reality is, some of the students from the polys can do very well and acquire that transdisciplinary skills because it forces them to take their motivation and create a portfolio over a series of time to develop the interest. But yet, that's not what the general trend of education is. Which part of our education system teaches about sense making? Perhaps today we talk about how artificial intelligence might and should be featured. We talk about sense making from applied learning curriculum from Ministry of Education. Right? But the question is it enough, and is it something that's sustainable that we can see? I mean, I'll take a step back. Honestly, what is transdisciplinary? So while we had a diagram from educational leadership that kind of talk trans is something that encompasses both, right? But we look at just from a disciplinarity standpoint. Most of our jobs are still organized in discipline. Right? They are still organized as discipline. You are an expert if you profess to be a specialist in medicine. You are an expert if you are an engineer because you specialize in that. But the reality is, architects don't always talk to engineers, right? For those of us who are Singaporeans, you know this. A couple of years back, just a couple of years back, when you have a complaint in the middle of the road, who do you write the complaint to? Do you write to NEA? Do you write to Land and Transport? Sometimes they'll just say, this is not our pasar, this is not our business, I'm sorry, we are not the place. But they can't actually tell you where to go for help. Right? A lot of problems today, wicked problems, I call them wicked problems because there is no one specialized discipline can give you the full, complete answer. And this is very real in the way that Singapore, as a hierarchical country, is being organized still because of how we organize things. Today, there's hope. Today, the hope is there is a common helpline that will help you to channel to the right place. But the fact is, as I look at some of these, a lot of our curriculum understanding goes now into interdisciplinary because project work in schools since the 80s is about interdisciplinary. What it requires of us is, hey, you learn this topic, right, in science. In art, you learn to create posters. In English, you write an oral presentation. That's called interdisciplinary. So the outcome of it requires you to bring in and create an outcome, a report, a project, dance and song, or something that requires you to bring a bit of this here and there together. Our question is, has it been taught well? A lot of how we design STEM, and I'm not only saying this in Singapore, I'm also talking about the STEM development work in Southeast Asia, is skills-based. So when it's skills-based, I can teach you coding. I can make and give you a good, nice microbit project. The end of the day, you can bring home and say, hey, I've learned STEM. My question is, you have taught STEM skills. Have you learned STEM attributes? And are you competent enough to take what you learn and apply it to a different context? That is the biggest hoo-ha and the issue with interdisciplinary project learning in Singapore. Even in the way that we design applied learning programs, which is big now in all MOE schools. Problem is, are teachers skilled to help students to acquire the right competencies and to be able to use the skills and the knowledge into a different context and to be able to skill up based on the challenges and the mitigating factors? Transdisciplinary is tends in the literature review to be featured more as a higher education mode of learning. Because at higher education, and we can see how this is being done even in NTU, who has come up with several other transdisciplinary learning offerings. NUS, while they bring down the Yale Liberal Arts College, but they are also offering another transdisciplinary learning in, I think, engineering. But the reality is, breaking out of traditional context requires two things. Before I can come out and tell you I'm creative, right, I must know what is breaking out of the box. Before I can break out of the box, question is, do you know what's the box? Do you know what's the box? What's the perimeters of the box? What makes up the box? What are the components of the box? What's the shape, texture of the box? I'm saying this because through transdisciplinary learning, we expect learners to be able to be creative with a clear understanding of what are the foundational knowledge inside there. So before I can break something, a lot of people say, let's be rojak, a mixture of things. But to be rojak, I must first know, how does tapioca taste like with the rojak sauce? How the rojak sauce, how sweet, how much vinegar to add, how much of the sugar is enough so that the peanut sauce can come out and bring out the real Singapore eclectic rojak flavor. Until I know all of that, I can't necessarily produce a transdisciplinary without the foundational knowledge. I cannot break out of the box if I cannot tell you what the box is. And that to me is the biggest gap. Now, I'm going to stop here because I don't want to go too deep in the literature research behind this. But we know for sure that things need to move and things are changing. What does transdisciplinary solutions look like? At the ground level, where we talk about policies, where we talk about healthcare, we talk about life science and biotechnology, these are transdisciplinary solutions and offerings. That's why I focus on not just big talks, but how do you make it happen? I talk about these dimensions of design. Today, we talk about design. A lot of people think about design thinking. But again, careful with that, because design thinking is not just a whole slew of programs and strategies. Design thinking is also what leads to the thinking of designerly. Some of our friends today are from Ateneo. Hello, Mabuhay. Right? And I know that part of Ateneo's university, which is one of the biggest universities in Philippines, has put in that plan, 2020 plan, for them to create curriculum and practice transdisciplinary with an authentic global perspective. Question is, how do you design that? How do you enact that? In what form? How is the assessment? How is it tied to community? How is it tied to the workforce? How does this all tie into developing each graduate with those skill sets so that it is not just the know-how, not just the products or artifacts, but the fact that it's immediate, that I can see that the development of the child or the student is in situ. That at any point of time that I can take the graduate and say, you are ready for hire, we are just allowing you the space to grow and develop your expertise. And that's why there's this big term about T-shape. STEM today has taken a very different life of its own. We see solutions as STEM as a way to open up future learning. But the question is, has the learning been taught, been well learned? And are the STEM concepts itself sometimes narrowing? Even in NIE, where I used to be working, in the National Institute of Education, they have just created a Mary STEM Center in NIE itself, plotting new frontiers in STEM education. But this is the STEM Quartet instructional framework. And the reality is, from all instructional framework, there are always tensions. So this framework is useful. Feel free to download and read this. I think it's very insightful. It talks openly about the challenges and the tensions of how STEM is being willed together. I'm saying this because in my work, I started as, let me share with you, I'll talk about one of my biggest innovation in redesigning STEM application in my very first school that I designed. But I would say today, based on the past 6 years of work and research, taking beyond 21st century competencies and looking beyond just programmatic design, I say that at the primary school level, at the secondary school level, how do you ensure that the transferable learning has been gained and taught well? How do you ensure that students really are not just being schooled for head knowledge? These 3 dimensions are critical in the way that I support schools in redesigning their work. Number 1, are the problems that you give students wicked enough? Honestly, throw them a wicked problem with no solutions. But I'll tell you that the biggest pushback in implementation are teachers. Because teachers will tell you, I am not equipped to teach wicked problems. Because in disciplines, we always have solutions, we have algorithm, we have reasoning, a way to look at problems. Right? But the fact is, wicked problems has never ever been featured as a curriculum or program in schools. Number 2, I argue that motivation is important. And that's why a lot of collaboration in schools today, I feel, are very artificial. Because I say I group you together, I ask you all to learn and mix and do research together, you learn collaboration. But I challenge the cow and say this: don't let students just use collaborative learning as a way to mask their insufficiency. The reality is, every graduate one day goes out to the marketplace has to be an advocate or an agent. Even if I say I'm an engineer ex-graduate, I'm an expert in this field. That's why I chose to opt this job, because I want to see whether the job expectations meet my own career aspirations. Now, that's a big problem. This is a big problem because the fact is, how many of our young people today clearly knows what they want to be? So career aspirations become, let's do a bit of profiling, and it's not. I argue even in the way that I support curriculum design and those more progressive educations in this. What's the prior knowledge that each child has? How do you profile them so that you know they come together for a very specific purpose? Go back to the earlier diagram, right, where you come in from a focus or specialization. I come in from, and that's where we trans, because the trans thing is meaningful, because what can I learn from you that I do not know you know? What can we create that deals with the solution of a problem, a wicked problem that we yet do not have ready-made answers? But from a design perspective, and this is where I'm going to reach out to all the foundations in the world. For those who are running foundations, hear me out. One of the most important points that I feel is a big failure is this: curriculum has always been too linear. Because it's more efficient, because it's easier to implement, because I can have milestone checks and exams to do that. But today, authentic learning in the world is this. I give you a problem, you must be able to tell me what are the key prioritization, what are the biggest challenge, what are the things that you don't know, what are the potential action plans, and what are the anticipated or non-anticipated issues related to that. That's why I may broadly call this flexible process, but the fact is the outcomes must also change. I'll skip this, but I use this as a way, activity theory, to say, how do you best design a curriculum going forward? I dare to challenge some of these because my biggest heartbeat, very honestly, is this. You want a progressive education, right? You want students to feel empowered as change agents. But until the exam system has changes that allows that to happen, otherwise it's just a lot of noise and talk. I'm glad and heartened to know, of course, that MOE has put in a lot more, particularly in coursework, in project-based learning, in portfolio assessment, and applied learning. But based on my authentic assessment research, right, where I look at how do you authenticate learning? How do you really authenticate learning? Because the reality is when you go out to the bosses and you apply for a job, it is not just about how well your A and B is, but the fact is I can quickly help you to problematize an issue. I can offer you solutions that look at some of these. I can even plan into the future. Some of these skills are authentic, right? It's not just IQ. It's neither just EQ. It's not even SQ. No, I'm not talking about SQ as a symbol airlines, right? But I'm talking about the spirituality of knowing what is important to a person, to the culture of the company, what is important to the larger social, economical issues of the country. That's where I think my work and assessment has forced me to look at transdisciplinary very differently. A lot of people say, let's do a bit of assessment. But I argue, and forgive me if I step on your feet, but I argue that assessment must be the driver of learning. But not assessment. When I talk about assessment, I'm not always talking about measurement. I'm not talking about measurement. I'm not even talking about evaluation by matrix. Right? But I'm talking about how some of these parts are important in the way that we design in the curriculum, such that the kind of projects, the kind of engagement, the kind of interactions allows all of these to happen, right? So if you ask me, John, specifically, if you're an educator, how might we make authentic learning real? The 3 points of how I advance solo taxonomy, patchwork, and portfolio assessment are important. A lot of teachers say, hey, let's go for rubrics to measure skills. But rubrics can still be taught to the test. And the reality is we don't necessarily know how to teach competencies. Happy to share more of these. But
John, sorry, to cut you off, not to cut you off, just to remind you that his time is running. Okay. Maybe you can, I think you have some examples to share, then maybe we can spend some time to share about it, then we can open for the discussion.
So I'm going to share all the slides with you guys. Please feel free to get in touch with me. I'm going to share 3 models of how I have developed transdisciplinary learning. Okay, let me show you my 3 models, and let me just jump start. One of the things that I talk about transdisciplinary learning is this. Firstly, it's based on my second point that we need to engage the learners. One of the things that we don't do enough before we can talk about teaching for self-regulated or independent learning is we don't catch enough of the personal attention and interest and motivation. And today, if your content is boring, emotional learning is not there. Don't tell me about getting students to be excited, because engaged learning will just be meaning a lot of activities, which not necessarily will help your learning. Right? That's one way of how I design some of these. I'm talking about this because I look from the learner's perspective beyond interest and motivation. How do you actually help them to apply some of these skills in curriculum development so that you design people specifically to that? Let me share with you just 2 of these 4 projects, right? So in my first school where I was running a STEM school, right? I asked the question, what is worth learning? And I got the team to co-design this with me. And the reality is I didn't just employ teachers. I told my teachers, you serve as facilitators, but I employed what I call as STEMmeritants. STEMmeritants. STEM, Samaritans, but STEMmeritants. My Samaritans are basically industry experts because they teach about disciplinary understanding. These are things that teachers can't teach. I employ architects because the way they break down problems are very different from how, for example, Turner, who's there as a computational expert, very different from game designer, who's the young chap on the side who designs games. Right? But when they bring together, we look at how they are able to generate new questions. One of the key parts that I argue is a good STEM curriculum needs to enable us to design and ask better questions. And that was my doctoral study, right? Problem finding. Some of the features of the work that I do with a couple of schools in Singapore, right, deals with that. More importantly, even till today, while we don't throw away exams, the biggest question I ask is, how will STEM help us, or how will any transdisciplinary learning bring about this? So that it's no longer about excelling exams, but about conceptual understanding knowledge. Right. Final point, final example. Right now, I am desperately looking for grants to upskill this project. I call it dance as a universal language. Can I just show you a dance video? So I teach K-pop dance as my CCA, but I see how people with different medical issues enjoy dance and at the same time not only build a community, but starts to be actively involved in bringing about change. And so in some of the work, as we design programs and leadership camps, I get them to use online learning to go overseas so that they start to explore culture, they start to explore dynamics of how same concepts are learned differently, right? And this, for example, is something that we just did for Hong Kong. I am not honestly a business person, but I have ideas to translate some of these educational programs to make it work. For example, look at what kids do in this camp over a stint of just 15 minutes. They are just given a task to redesign Cambodia's one of the oldest temples.
And it's quite expensive, and it's known for its beauty of surrounding it as well, and it's also reflected onto the lake that's below it, and it's a very popular attraction for people who are going to Cambodia.
So,
this specific picture that we were trying to recreate, we really focused on trying to get the sea.
So this is an example of transdisciplinary, where the task itself, the activity itself, requires them to use the most basic knowledge, but to do a bit of research on the culture and to design it with a future in mind, right? So their job is not only digitizing this, but showing aspects and features of this temple to be recreated so that it creates a virtual experience for them to learn about history, culture, and politics, right?
And it's 12th century.
So this is another program that we are very, very excited with. I got excited because a lot of these countries around us haven't really started school yet. They have been locked down since last year. But I piloted this with Sarawak. And English is a second language for them. But the feedback from them is this. They not only learn how to dance, and to me, it's not about learning dancing skills, but it's about how the dance teaches you about confidence, how embodied learning. Remember, I talked about you must feel it. You must be able to take actions. A lot of our school is still a lot of head knowledge. So through dance, they learn all of these. Right? It's in the curriculum design that makes it work. Right? I am excited because I know it has seen it. The Sarawak students went to share with the Japanese students. Take note. We all know for the fact that most Japanese students don't really speak fluent English. And the Sarawak students learn English as a second language. But when they communicated on the same concept, the Japanese students tell us what can they do to learn what they have just learned. And all that took place in 2 hours. So a lot of these is about that skill sets, the knowledge, and how you merge them together with some of the work. I just want to end here because I have so many other examples to show what has happened, right? But clearly, from a piece of dance, this is what a child can do. From a 1 hour dance with Uncle John I asked them to create a cartoon storyboard, envisioning what they like to do in the future by first identifying a problem. And this is a group of secondary 3 students from Sarawak. Right? They can draw, they can type, they can cut out pictures, but it's about a mind map. It's about a storyboard that envisages the future. And this was an artifact from a child's work. The fact is, it is authentic to the learner. It is authentic to a big global issue. It is even authentic to themselves, because I asked, where are you in this picture? And what can you do as part of the step forward? I think I'll stop here and hand the time back to Hoi Leong. There are some of questions that we have designed for us to dive deeper, and I'm happy to answer any questions. Sorry, I get too excited.
Yes, thanks, John, for the sharing. And I think even with like quite a lot of time, we are only touching the surface of what you could potentially share more. But before, I guess maybe we can all share more and discuss more going forward. We'd like to move on to the session that we also have hear from everybody who is here today, and based on that, we can have some. Okay, I think people say that you cannot hear me. So let me reload this browser and see if you all can hear me. Yes. Hello, John. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So hope that now you all can hear me. It may be silent to some of you for the past like one minute. Okay, but in the interest of time, maybe I'll just continue to bring everybody to the second session. That will be, as what John has mentioned just now, we have prepared a few questions and want to make the next part of discussion more like a co-learning and a two-way discussion. Okay, so now I think all of you should be able to see this like Google document-like page where actually all of you can also put your, if you click on the document, you can type in your views and feedback. So it's a document that every one of us can input. Okay. So on this document now there are 4 questions that John would like to hear from everybody. You can answer some of them or all of them, depending on what views do you have. And then we'll have the next maybe 5 minutes that all of you can write down answers to these questions. You can put down your name first and then your views. Then based on that, we will have a discussion or we'll pick up some of the interesting topics and have a dialogue from there. Okay, so I think you all can also read, so you all can start to type in your answers now. But maybe like John, you would like to make your like commentary, or you can talk along the way while everybody is trying to like think of the answers to some of these questions, and we can share about the intent of some of these questions and so on. Yeah.
Sure.
Yes.
No, the fact is this: a lot of these work are still in pilot and progress until we talk about university level. But honestly, my sense is when we tell students go to university, they are already very fixated on what they want. They're already very clear on what they want to go on. So the trajectory is very clear. My argument is a lot of these can already be taught at primary and secondary school level, right? But the question is, what needs to change? What needs to change? The biggest constraint for most education systems, if you still go by programs, then clearly, how do you build, for example, micro-credentialing? Right? Make it worthwhile, right? The fact is, at adult level, we go Coursera Udemy, right? We get credentials, but we get all these badges, right? What's your badge, right? So the badge is powerful because the badge gives me authority that I know my work well. That's where portfolio is. But the question is, how might some of these actually look like? And how can we take this beyond? I will be very honest, a couple of my sharing, my models are still very stuck in just looking at programs that is add-on, right? Because that's where schools are more open. But the fact is, I feel something needs to change, and we are developing and designing that. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you, Jay. Thank you, Yen Yen. Thank you, Chris. You're right. Right, Chris? Teachers' professional learning, teachers' own motivation is one of the draw factors and also one of the push factors. Right? The fact is, especially not only in Singapore, in fact, I would dare to say Singapore teachers are a lot more open, right? But a lot of other countries, especially in Southeast Asia, that's where my heartbeat is. A lot of the Southeast Asia teachers are not ready, and they don't have the space nor the motivation to change.
For John, maybe for the for question 2, right? Would there be some maybe hints that you can share with the participants so that so there may be more?
Sure. So examples are this. For the longest time, we know internship, and internship works, right? Internship works because it gives you that contextual and experiential experience of working in the industry that you're interested in. Right? How might other forms of this kind of model, right, that helps us to look beyond? So internship clearly is one model. A lot of, for example, dance as a universal language. The one that I'm really asking, can somebody support us, give us a grant to test out the idea? Because we see how, despite the fact that language may still be a barrier, but as long as the child's motivation is hitched and caught, right, they're able to actually extend beyond themselves, right? And that's where we saw, for example, from Sarawak and Japan, right, that both sides, the language was the biggest barrier, yet because of the lack of language competency, wow, they're able to connect. They're able to connect more deeply because there are certain shared points. And that's where the transing is. Transing is not just also about knowledge. Transing is also going beyond the emotional connection, but relating subject matter knowledge to relating to finding the right group of people. Today, for example, in our workplace, we talk about T-shaped people, right? T-shaped. You know enough breadth, but depth in a specialized area. That to me is a model that we can work towards. But how do you design that? Or how might that be something that is clear in our education system? Yeah, Kersing, you're right. When there's no 10-year series, we don't know how to facilitate more effectively. But you see, mindset is also the biggest problem. The saddest thing about how I see some schools enact growth mindset, right? Carol Dweck's growth mindset is even more frightening because it designed a curriculum, a program for teachers to teach open mindset, growth mindset. But the fact is the school culture is still very much a fixed mindset. So what is taught versus what I observe, right? There is a dichotomy. And that frightens me because the reality is, how do I shift a system and to build a culture? And the question is this, actually, how open is Singaporeans looking to transdisciplinary work? I'm saying this because as we look at the profile of young people today, it's no longer just about the millennials. It's no longer just about the millennials, but we looked at what are the preferences of the geriatric millennials, right? The group of millennials that are in between digital versus non-digital. Right? And that frightens us because the fact is, we know many of us struggle with some of these issues.
Okay, John, maybe like for some of those interesting comments that you pick up, we can invite that person to share more about maybe why they make that point.
Let's go question by question. Jake, you made a very important word, without proper context and preparation. Could you just explain a little bit more? What do you mean by context and what kind of preparations do you feel is needed?
Hi, Jay, I think you can unmute yourself. Yes. Hey, yes.
Hi.
Hi, Jay.
Yeah, well, because sometimes in most cases, when a new trend comes in, most schools would like to adopt it right away because it's the in thing. But the thing is, if your structure does not support it, or if your school does not have that vision of adapting that new technique or new pedagogy or new style of teaching, the effort all goes to waste, and you know, the students and the teachers end up getting frustrated, which means that instead of being motivated to do more, they end up, you know, taking 2 steps back instead of moving forward. So sometimes, in most cases, you have to take the best of both worlds, your world and whatever it is that you're observing. In most cases, we try to to get everything and put it in your own context without studying how your students work, how your structure works, how your platform works. So sometimes it ends up not getting the things that you hoped for. And so that's what I think. So
Thank you. But you see, the reality is, as long as we still have exams as a key focus and milestone check, then people look at then what are the knowledge base that students need to have. That's why curriculum has always been designed from knowledge level. Right? But the reality is, as the world is changing today with the VUCA world, that's the hard part to marry back into education. Right? And that's why we see very interesting models of how education is changing in, for example, the US, where they have more charter schools to pilot different ways or innovative ways of redesigning education. Right? That to me is something that I'm not sure whether we're ready to embrace that. Right? To Tak Leong, you say what other models? Tak Leong, you mentioned something. You said about some companies embed, I think that's Tak Leong, right? Embed, yeah, bro. Wicked problem. Tell us how that happens. Because really, I mean, wicked problem is so wicked, right? People rather don't talk about it. But the fact is, we cannot run away until a crisis happens. So explain a bit more, Ken. What do you mean by how do the companies embed this?
I mean, like, companies right now, at least not traditional companies, but cutting edge one, right? Like those dealing with AI companies, or like those working in the cutting edge sectors, they are inherently facing this kind of problems. They are trying to first solve 21st century problems, right? Which then have different departments working together to a common goal, and then they are facing such wicked problems. Then let's say universities or even secondary schools and polytechnics, they can collaborate to shape this or collaborate together in a sense and work on these problems lah. Yeah, because even those companies don't have answers, and the answer could come from a student. You never know, right? So the co-op model that some universities actually adopt.
I like that. I only wish really there's a lot more openness and it becomes more porous because the reality is still that higher education, especially in Southeast Asia, they are still very institutional. It's not porous enough for the exchange of knowledge. Right? I know at least in Singapore we have done well generally as a system, especially at the polytechnic level. That part, I think, based on what you said, is highly successful, right? At the polytechnic level, right? That to me is something I wish we can scale up a lot more. Challenge with that goes back to tolerance for wicked issues. Tolerance for wicked issues, because the tolerance level is this: people want a closure, people want ready-made solutions, right? And that's why in design thinking, one of the hardest things to teach about design thinking in Singapore schools, right, is a lot of the prototypes sometimes are just very nice to look at. It looks good, but the reality is teachers feel that it's just regurgitation of old ideas, right? But the question is whether the processes have been put in place to enable that. I read somebody's question below. Someone that asked this question: what's the difference? How would transdisciplinary differ from primary and secondary schools? Clearly, one of the things I would emphasize is this: in transdisciplinary, you really must have a subject matter expertise in areas. And I'm saying this because this goes beyond, by the way, this goes beyond just your English, your math, and science. I once had a student who ponteng, sorry guys, in Singapore, ponteng means you skip school. A normal tech student who skipped school for 3 months. But because in normal tech, nobody really cares about him. But when I found out why he skipped school, it wasn't because he hated school, but because he was busy preparing himself to take part in an international gaming competition. And he made it. And the reality is, this is a normal technical student who, honestly, not looked upon favorably by teachers. But the fact is, we can find gems like this because why they become so good at what they do. Right? How do I build that? How do I create those space so that really, do we need more standardization? Honestly, in my research on authentic assessment, right, sometimes standardization really is now backfiring on us. It's backfiring on us, right? As an education system, as a country, as an economy, you need certain standards and benchmarks. But the reality is innovation is such, right, that it requires process. It requires time and it requires that tolerance to failure. So it's easy to say, right? We embrace failure. Right? A lot of people say we embrace failure. But the fact is, how many times will you fail so that I can find the aha? That's the hard part. Right? I can give you the solution to this. My sense of designing a transdisciplinary learning curriculum that embraces failure needs to anchor on 2 points. You ask the question, I'll tell you what my experience is. The 2 points are these. That collaboration learning is important when you select students with different motivations or profiles or preferences, so that they are open to appreciate somebody else's gifts, talents, or expertise. That's one. When they do that, then it's no longer about, hey, you score A and I score F, right? But it's about, oh, you're so good at this, right? How would you're thinking, right? Help me to design this better. Hey, can I tell you what I think from here? Now, this kind of collaboration does happen in very tight environments, particularly at the Polytechnic. I wish more of these is being embraced at primary and secondary school level, where students can tell you. That's why I created this dance as a universal language, because one of the key things is you must get young people first to identify where their strengths are. In my whole team, one of them are inside here. Iris, can you shout out and say hi, unmute yourself? Iris was my latest hire. But everybody else on my team, right, were either my ex-students or people I've worked with. But Iris is only much younger, half my age, and he is still a student. Iris, where are you?
Yeah, I'm here.
Iris, say hello.
Hi. Nice to
Say
meet
something.
you guys.
Say something in the language that you are known for to me.
네, 안녕하세요. 저는 아이리스라고요. 네, 너무 반갑습니다. 네, 잘 부탁드리고요. 네.
네, 감사합니다.
감사합니다. That's only that I can say yes.
Iris is still undergraduate. He is a Malaysian, but he's studying in a Korean university. I look to him because he has strengths and gifts that I look up to, and I want to learn from him. And because he's very open to learning, and his way of thinking is very different from me. So I see him not as an employer, an employee. I see him as my equal, because I'll say, hey, can you help me with some of this work? Clearly some of the work is, but some of the things he really helps in shaping and the design of some of the work. Now I question, can we have this kind of openness to seeing people's strength, especially in schools? Right? We need to model that. We need to model some of these, because the openness is where earlier Yen, right, or somebody wrote about mindset, right? Now, how does that mindset translate from just an ideology into that? This is important, because before I can I must be able to see gaps. Before I can see gaps, I must be able to appreciate difference. This is as simple as it gets. Let me say again, before I can transdiscipline something, I must be able to appreciate gaps by knowing what my foundation is. So I must know myself very well. I must know either not just my academic results, but why I love certain subjects. What are the process skills behind that? Excuse me, you say, well, John, I demand a lot. But honestly, for example, a Montessori curriculum allows the child to already have that level of self-awareness. They may not be able to articulate that, but they are aware of that. Right? They are aware of that. And that to me is so powerful. What's next is create the opportunity for that to happen. Right? That's where allowing students then to work on very real challenges is so important. Right? Let's answer a couple of other thoughts before we close to this session. Anything interests you, Hoi Leong?
Something that I catch is about this concept of social emotion learning and the understanding emotion, which is actually just what you have mentioned right before I start talking, right? And it also triggers me the thinking of when we have been talking about this word called transdisciplinary, and having is transdisciplinary is still based on this word called discipline, right? And from the layman understand discipline is like your maths and languages and all this. But then there's this different category of stuff or learning called like emotional learning, or maybe like learning how to learn. No, that is not a typical discipline, but I think everybody will have agreed. Looking at all of the inputs about this future skills necessary, like those seems to be even more important. Then I'm just very so starting from this point that a few of the members mentioned about emotional, like competencies. How does it sit in this transdisciplinary? How to look at it from the transdisciplinary perspective? Yeah, it's something that I was very interested to when I look at everybody's input. Yes.
Yeah, one of the things I think that's most critical is this: we haven't built enough that level of confidence in our learners. And I'm really saying, honestly, you have a learning outcome in your exam syllabus. Every exam have an exam syllabus. But the reality is, how do we know that they really know? You know what I mean? How do they know that they really know? So we still look at, for example, makerspace because we see by the artifacts. We still look at, for example, a gamification because they create a game. But the fact is, this is the first prototype that they have done, right? But in each of these good prototypes or activities, right? Activity-based learning or experiential learning, they're all good. But the fact is, the biggest shift we really must have a conversation around is this. Don't just use the first time and say, nah, I give you a great congratulations. This is now part of your holistic report card. You know, the fact is, even teachers are still exploring. And the reality is, as the child makes, right, they start to become more interested. That's where the emotional part is. Emotional is not just emotion feeling happy, right? The part of feeling shitty about it is like, wow, why did I fail? Right? Feeling that elation that says, I found this problem. I'm able to solve this problem. Now, those comes as part of the process. Journaling is one way to capture that, making that explicit. But what other ways? By having that called dialogic conversation. That's why there's this term called dialogic thinking, where the child actually coach themselves or peer each other to challenge themselves and look at the problem from multiple perspectives so that they understand that what they have created isn't just a product, but the multi-layer of developmental work. I mean, in the true spirit of prototyping, really, people take the word prototype and just say prototype 2 times, 3 times, but that's not enough, right? One of the simplest way that I dare to say is this. One of the things I would challenge schools to do differently is this. Don't just give a closing date and say submit by when. Because it only and forces students to work to finality, the final part, which has very high fidelity. But in good process learning, where you want the child to really reflect and gain that self-confidence to say, hey, actually, I'm getting better at this. I'm getting better at this. It's where you allow them to have multiple revisions. Right? Of course, there are set dates, but you allow that multiple revisions to allow the child to refine their work. Right? And that's why I anchor. It must first start. Our biggest mistake in education is we always force students to collaboration. So you're going to work in groups, but without getting them to say, what do you bring to the group? That is the biggest gap, because then everybody wait for each other. If I know what I am good at and I bring to the group, when I was doing that future car design back in Denmark, back in 2009, I was very clear that I come in as being a curriculum expert from a Singapore education system. I work with geographers, I work with cartoonists, but we are all working towards designing a future car. Right? So I come in ready to say, from an education perspective, right, which of those dimensions are something that's teachable? What are the concepts behind engineering of car? And everybody kind of talk about that. Now, do we develop enough of that? If you don't, right, I think we can kind of, it's hard to push that transdisciplinary learning forward. Reality is today's work, right? Everything is transdisciplinary. We no longer just look to the IT department to solve our ICT issues. All of us are supposed to have certain ICT skills to be able to do up PowerPoints, to be able to make effective Excel sheets, right, to prepare concise research data findings. But the fact is, all of these is still not translated in the way. That's why I'm looking at models. Sorry, the more I speak, the more I'm fired up.
Yeah, talking about models, and maybe also I would like to invite maybe Yan to share a little bit of what you mentioned. And I think, and just now Tadeo shared a little bit about work, wicked problems. And I think Yan, you have a similar idea about what the model being work, right? So maybe if you have, maybe you can share a bit about what you were trying to write. But at the same time, I also have a question that, like, if it seems to be so maybe obvious that it's a good way, transdisciplinary learning. Like, what is stopping this from happening? Like, and to me, one of the things is like how to facilitate learning the unknown, right? Something that actually I was wondering, like, so the example that Yan raised about running a store, yes, like it's definitely good, right? But how running a store has so many things, and if there's someone may think that, oh, if they don't have some basic knowledge of maths, something, then they wouldn't even know that they don't know this, and just running them through running a store, right? It might not work. So yes, maybe from your perspective and your experience, what would you say?
Yeah,
Yes.
so I thought about John Dewey
Yes.
because can you hear me?
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
So I mean, really we started thinking about disciplinary knowledge in like the 1900s, where when science became a big deal, and the belief that everything has to be broken down into pieces, including knowledge, and we have to basically have, in order for society to improve, we have to break things down like a factory into small little pieces, including knowledge. So what John Dewey has always advocated is that, basically to design curriculum around social activity. So for example, running a school store. So in the Chicago Lab School, he would have kids run a school store. But he always emphasized that disciplinary knowledge was still extremely important. So it wasn't just doing activities for the sake of doing activities. You have a great time and then that's the end of it. So he always emphasized that what happens after the school store, for example, running a school store, for example, is you still had your math teacher, you still had a science teacher, but they were kind of in relation to running a school store. So in later years, as kind of a chain of schools like the Coalition of Essential Schools, what they started doing was, kind of a version of project-based learning. So any kind of graduation would entail a student creating a project out of a question that they've asked about the world. So for example, if my question is where does poop and pee go, for example, then it becomes a whole question of architecture, of urban design, of science, and so on, right? And then what they did was, around the project, there are certain requirements that the students had to fulfill in each subject area. They had to show knowledge, expertise in each subject area, and the final evaluation would always be an expert panel that involved somebody who is a judge of their choice, an expert in plumbing, for example, for that question. So somebody in the field, a panel of, so it was a very expensive evaluation because it always required a panel at the end of it, but it was highly effective and the students really, really learned a lot and could kind of move across disciplines. But what's important is that John Dewey always kind of emphasized that you correlate all knowledge in social activity, but you have to learn the disciplinary knowledge out of that social activity.
Good point. So based on what Ian shared, so for those who are keen, just write to Hua Leong or myself, refer to activity theory, right? Activity theory as a framework, because that's where activity theory, if I can just share the slides, no time. Activity theory is this triangle where there is division of labor, there is subject matter knowledge, there is outcome, there are tools, right? So clearly, how do you each have that division of role? So Google activity theory, Engstrom, ENGESTROM. Right, I use activity theory to design ICT models for BIM models, right? Because clearly you can segmentize some of these, but you know what and where are the foundational knowledge required, right? And that to me is important, because otherwise a lot of people just pull things together, but you can't ensure the transing happens, because the trans requires you to know which part and which part to let go, which parts are those that leads to the unknown. Right? And that to me is a very real future ready skill because it is a skill that we all need to develop. How, we're not sure, right? But today I know, for example, I am a subject matter expert in the area of development of creativity and curriculum design. But at the same time, my T skills are I enjoy dancing. I take pride in being able to be passionate about driving for youth empowerment, right? I have some knowledge about policy work, right? And all of these builds that breadth. But at the same time, what areas do I dare to speak with authority, right? That to me is useful, right? And I think that is something that we all need to really consider, because otherwise, everybody thinks they know everything of a little bit, but clearly tomorrow's world requires people to be an expert somehow, especially because technology now makes known what is already common sense. What was common sense in the past really is no longer common sense enough today.
I pasted the link of the activity theory in Wikipedia to the chat. So for those of you who are interested, you can click on that link to find out more from there. And to close off the session, and maybe have one more last wise words from John, right? What do you think all of us individually can do in our daily context to advocate this transdisciplinary learning?
It goes with the very first question that we shared, right? Yeah. What are you actually doing? It is not a I have transdisciplinary skill, right? Because there are two C's that I want to give. One is capacity, and then the second C is capability. Capability is knowing what you're already very good at work, that you enjoy doing, that you have a lot of knowledge, right? But at the same time, capacity is how do I stretch that beyond in other contexts, right? And that to me is important, because as you transdiscipline the way you work, you realize the research can also suggest, right? You realize that you also gain a lot of mastery at other areas, right? At other areas of your professional life and personal life. And that to me is something that the space of really ready to unlearn, but being very confident of what you have, all right? And then to be able to add in multiple layers to that. That to me is a skill set that I see in all the people that I want to develop, right? And I kind of work with them, because clearly coaching them in those directions requires somebody with that disciplinary understanding. But that openness to embrace change is actually even more important.
Okay, so the important thing to remember, maybe if there's one thing that we must remember today, is the openness to embrace change, and then it will lead us to us learning transdisciplinary, and also maybe facilitating others to learn in a transdisciplinary manner. Yeah, the word very long, very hard to pronounce. Anyway, yes. Okay, so yes, so we come to the end of the sharing and the discussion sessions. Thank you everyone for participating today, and also for putting down your thoughts into the document just now. To wrap up this session, I just want to show everyone, maybe for those who have here for the first time, some of the things that we have covered this year. So, and which is quite a wide range of things, and we welcome everybody who are thinking about maybe exploring learning, very generally speaking, in different sense. If there's topics that you would like to explore, please feel free to suggest what you might want to hear. And then as a community, we'll see how we can co-learn in these different directions. Okay. And for the next session, I've invited one of my friends also to talk about this topic about mental well-being of children. I think especially those of you in Singapore, what happened in last month was in the month of July, there was something really tragic that happened. And again, it's a wake-up call for a lot of us adults in general, right? That like we really cannot not look at this. We must place a lot of more importance in this. So there's a startup that I know, they are based in Estonia, and they really want to solve this problem of how to improve the mental well-being of the children, both I guess from the well-being sense and also from this motivation perspective, which I think a few of you have mentioned today in the reflection. So yeah, so the next meetup will be roughly 1 month's time at the last Wednesday of this month on the 29th at the same time at 7 o'clock. Okay, so hope that hope that some of you who are interested in this topic will be able to join. Then we again have a sharing by Kadri, and then we have a discussion about this and what can we do with it. Okay, so very once again, very thank you everybody for attending, especially for John who shared his time to contribute to the learning of everybody. Okay, good night. Bye
Thank you. Good
bye.
night, everyone.
감사합니다.
ありがとうございます。
ありがとうございます。谢谢。Bye bye everyone.
さよなら。
Okay. Okay, John, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.